If you follow the wrong map long enough, you might end up exactly where you're meant to be. The rain came down in thin, slanted lines, turning the Manhattan streets into a blur of headlights and reflections as Emily Carter tightened her grip on the damp piece of paper in her hand, the ink bleeding at the edges where raindrops had soaked through, her fingers trembling not just from the cold, but from the quiet panic rising in her chest. Because nothing about tonight was going the way it was supposed to, not the directions, not the address, not her life, and definitely not the building. She now stood in front of, towering glass and steel stretching high above her like a world she didn't belong in, a world of polished marble floors and people who didn't check their bank accounts before ordering dinner, a world where a girl in a second-hand coat and worn-out flats would normally turn around before even touching the door. But Emily didn't turn around, because she had already come too far to quit now, because rent was overdue, because hope didn't knock twice, because the map in her hand, creased, smudged, and barely readable, insisted this was the place. So she pushed the door open and stepped inside, immediately swallowed by warmth, by the soft hum of conversation, by the quiet clink of glasses and distant laughter that felt expensive, controlled, like even the air had rules here, and she hesitated for just half a second as her reflection caught in the polished wall beside her, the coat that didn't quite fit, the hair damp from the rain, the uncertainty in her eyes. But then she exhaled slowly and moved forward, because pretending was easier than leaving, because maybe if she acted like she belonged, no one would question it. And that was when it happened. A woman in a sleek black suit approached her with a practiced smile and a tablet in hand, asking, "You're here for the Parker meeting, right?" And Emily froze, her mind scrambling to catch up. Parker meeting, none of it made sense. But something in the woman's tone suggested expectation, certainty, like this moment had already been decided. And before she could think too hard about it, before doubt could drag her back outside into the rain, Emily nodded, just once, small but enough. And that single motion changed everything. Because suddenly she was being guided past the lobby, past the security desk that didn't question her, past doors that opened without hesitation, deeper into a space that felt quieter, more powerful, until they stopped outside a set of double doors, and the woman gestured politely before stepping aside. "They've been waiting for you." And Emily's heart slammed hard against her ribs as she reached for the handle, her pulse loud in her ears, her thoughts racing. This is wrong. This is definitely wrong. But it was too late to turn back now. So she pushed the doors open and stepped inside, and the room fell silent. A long table lined with sharply dressed executives, screens glowing with charts and numbers she didn't understand, and at the head of it all, a man who looked up the moment she entered, his gaze steady, sharp, unreadable, the kind of presence that didn't need to raise its voice to command attention. And for a second, just a second, the entire world seemed to pause between them, until he leaned back slightly in his chair, a faint hint of something almost amused flickering in his expression, and said, "You're late." Emily swallowed, her voice barely steady as she replied, "I think I'm lost." And instead of correcting her, instead of ending the mistake right there, Liam Parker, the billionaire CEO everyone else in the room was waiting on, allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to form, as if he had just decided to follow the wrong map too. The silence in the room did not break all at once. It stretched, thin and fragile, like glass waiting to crack, as every pair of eyes shifted between Emily and the man at the head of the table. And she could feel it, the weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders, the unspoken question hanging in the air, who is she and why is she late? But no one said it out loud because he had not said it, and that alone told her everything about who he was, or at least who he appeared to be in this room, someone whose reactions set the rules for everyone else, someone whose smallest expression carried more authority than a raised voice ever could. And Emily's fingers tightened around the damp paper still clutched in her hand, the map now wrinkled beyond saving, as if it too knew. It had led her somewhere it was never meant to. And for a brief moment she considered the truth, considered blurting out an apology, turning around, admitting she did not belong here. But the way he was looking at her stopped her, not harsh, not judgmental, but curious, like he had just been handed an unexpected variable and was deciding whether to remove it or let it play out. And then he spoke again, calm and measured. Then you should probably take a seat before you get more lost. And a quiet ripple moved through the room, subtle, controlled, but unmistakably shifting, because that was permission, and suddenly the chair at the far end of the table was being pulled out for her, and Emily found herself walking toward it before her mind had fully caught up, each step echoing softly against the polished floor, her heart pounding louder with every second as she sat down carefully, trying not to draw attention to the fact that she had no idea what she was doing here, while across from her, screens flickered with charts and projections she could not begin to understand, numbers climbing and falling in neat, precise patterns that belonged to a world built on certainty, not guesswork, and she swallowed, forcing her hands to rest still on the table instead of fidgeting like they wanted to, because the last thing she could afford right now was to look as out of place as she felt. And then someone cleared their throat. A man in a gray suit leaning slightly forward, directing. His words not at her, but at him. "Should we continue, Mr. Parker?" And the name landed quietly but firmly in her mind. Parker. The same name the woman downstairs had mentioned. The same name that had opened every door without question, and Emily's gaze flickered back to him. To Liam, though she did not know his first name yet. Only that everything in this room seemed to orbit around him, and he gave a small nod, almost absent, before his attention returned to the discussion as if nothing unusual had happened, as if she had always been meant to be sitting there, and the meeting resumed, voices measured, confident, speaking in terms of millions and projections and deadlines that stretched months ahead, and Emily listened, trying to follow, catching fragments here and there, enough to understand that whatever this was, it mattered, that decisions made in this room would ripple far beyond these walls, and she should not be here. She definitely should not be here. And yet, no one was asking her to leave, and every now and then, she caught his eyes flicking toward her, brief, almost imperceptible glances, like he was checking to see if she would break first, if she would admit the mistake he had already chosen not to expose. And something about that, something about the silent agreement forming between them, steadied her just enough to breathe, just enough to stay, until suddenly, without warning, one of the executives turned directly to her and said, "And your thoughts?" And the world tilted again, sharp and immediate, because now there was no hiding, no quiet observation, only the expectation that she would speak, that she would belong. And for a split second, Emily felt the panic rise, cold and familiar, the same feeling she had known every time life had pushed her into a corner she was not prepared for. But then she looked down at the map still in her hand, at the faint lines that had once promised direction, and something shifted, something small but stubborn, because she had already come this far, already stepped into the wrong room, already taken the seat, and maybe, just maybe, she did not have to run this time. So she lifted her gaze, met theirs, and spoke, not with perfect confidence, not with polished language, but with honesty, raw and unfiltered. "I think you are all making it more complicated than it needs to be." And just like that, the room went silent again, but this time, it was different. This time, it was listening. No one interrupted her, and that was the first sign something had shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, but enough that the air in the room felt different, less rigid, more uncertain, as if the carefully constructed rhythm of the meeting had been nudged slightly off balance, and Emily felt it immediately, the way every eye was now fixed on her, not out of politeness anymore, but out of curiosity, because she had said something unexpected, something that did not belong to the language of projections and corporate precision, and for a heartbeat she wondered if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. But then, she noticed him, Liam Parker, watching her not with irritation, not with dismissal, but with interest, real and focused, like he had been waiting to see what she would do when the pressure finally landed. And that look alone gave her just enough courage to keep going, even as her voice remained steady only by effort. "You are talking about expanding into 3 new markets at the same time," she continued slowly, choosing her words carefully, not because she understood everything, but because she understood enough to recognize the tension in the room. The way people kept circling the same points without saying what they actually meant. "But it sounds like none of you are sure which one actually matters most." And a faint shift moved across a few faces, subtle but there, a tightening of expressions, a glance exchanged between two executives who had likely spent weeks preparing for this discussion. And Emily swallowed but did not stop, because stopping now would mean admitting she did not belong, and she had already gone too far for that. Where I come from, when something is too expensive to fix all at once, you start with what is breaking the fastest, she said, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of the damp map on the table, grounding herself in something familiar. And you focus on that until it stops falling apart. And the room stayed quiet, not dismissive, not mocking, but thinking, processing. And for a brief moment, Emily realized they were actually considering what she had said, not because she had said it perfectly, but because she had said it simply, honestly, in a way none of them had. And then one of the men leaned back slightly, arms crossing, his tone measured but less certain than before. And how would you determine which market is failing the fastest? And Emily hesitated, just for a second, because she did not have charts or data or years of experience to rely on. But she had instinct, and sometimes that was enough. You look at where people are leaving first, she replied, her voice quieter now, but no less firm. Not where you are gaining the most, but where you are losing the most, because that is where the problem is. And again, silence followed. But this time it felt heavier, more deliberate, like something real had just entered the conversation. And across the table, Liam's gaze did not leave her, his expression unreadable but intent. And then, slowly, he leaned forward, resting his hands lightly on the table as he spoke, his voice calm, but carrying an authority that immediately anchored the room. Pull the retention data for all three markets, he said without looking away from Emily. I want to see where the drop is happening first. And just like that, the energy shifted completely, not chaotic, not disruptive, but redirected. As assistants moved quickly, screens adjusted, conversations resumed with a new focus, and Emily felt a strange mix of disbelief and relief wash over her. Because somehow, impossibly, she had not been thrown out. She had not been exposed. Instead, she had been heard, and that realization sat quietly in her chest, unfamiliar but undeniable, as the meeting continued around her. And for the first time since she had walked through those doors, she was not just trying to survive the moment, she was part of it, even if she did not fully understand how. And as the discussion deepened, numbers aligning with her unexpected observation, confirmations forming in real time, Emily allowed herself a single, steady breath, unaware that this small, accidental contribution had just changed the way one of the most powerful men in the room was looking at her, not as a mistake, not as an interruption, but as something far more rare, something real. The meeting did not end with applause or acknowledgement. It ended the way powerful meetings often do, quietly, efficiently, as if nothing remarkable had happened at all. But Emily could feel it, the subtle difference in the way people gathered their things, the way a few glances lingered on her a second longer than before, not quite understanding who she was, but no longer dismissing her as someone who did not belong. And that alone made her chest feel tight, with a mix of relief and disbelief. Because just an hour ago she had been standing outside in the rain wondering if she would even make it through the door, and now she had somehow made it through something far more intimidating without being asked to leave. And as chairs slid back and quiet conversations resumed, she reached for the edge of the table, her fingers brushing against the damp map again, grounding herself before she stood, careful, controlled, trying to move like someone who knew exactly where she was going. Even though every instinct told her to walk fast, to get out before anyone stopped her, before someone asked the question she had been avoiding this entire time. Who are you? And for a moment it almost worked. She made it halfway to the door, blending into the movement of executives heading out, her head slightly lowered, her steps measured, but then his voice cut through the noise. Calm, direct, impossible to ignore. Miss, and she froze, not dramatically, not suddenly, but enough that she felt it in her shoulders, the way tension crept in instantly, because she knew this was the moment everything would unravel, and slowly she turned back, her grip tightening on the map as she met his gaze again. Liam Parker still seated at the head of the table, though everyone else had begun to leave, his attention fixed entirely on her now. And for a second, neither of them spoke, the space between them filled with everything that had not been said yet, until he stood, adjusting his jacket with a casual precision that somehow made the room feel smaller, more focused, and he walked toward her, not rushed, not hesitant, just certain, stopping a few feet away, close enough that she could see the faint reflection of the room in his eyes, close enough that pretending suddenly felt a lot harder than it had before. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower now, quieter, but no less controlled. "You are not on the guest list." And there it was, simple, undeniable, the truth she had been outrunning since the moment she stepped inside. And Emily exhaled slowly, the fight draining out of her all at once, because there was no point continuing the act now, no point pretending she belonged when she had never been meant to be here in the first place. And she nodded once, a small, honest motion as she held up the crumpled map slightly, almost like evidence of her mistake. "I think I walked into the wrong building," she admitted, her voice steady but softer now, stripped of the thin layer of confidence she had forced earlier. And for a second she expected it, the dismissal, the polite but firm request to leave, the quiet end to whatever strange moment this had been. But instead, he looked at the map, really looked at it, his gaze tracing the blurred lines and smeared ink as if it held more meaning than it should. And then he glanced back at her, something unreadable flickering in his expression, not annoyance, not amusement exactly, but something closer to interest. And he asked, "And you decided to stay?" Not as an accusation, not even as a question, but as an observation. And Emily let out a small breath, almost a laugh without humor. "I did not know how to leave without making it worse," she said honestly, because that was the truth, because sometimes staying felt easier than admitting you were lost. And for a moment, silence settled between them again. But this time it was different, not tense, not uncertain, just still, as if the world outside the room had paused long enough for something unexpected to take shape. And then, to her surprise, he reached out, not to take the map, not to stop her, but simply to gesture toward the hallway behind her. "Come with me," he said, calm, certain, like this decision had already been made. And Emily hesitated, just for a second, her instincts pulling in two directions at once, one telling her to leave while she still could, the other reminding her that she had already followed the wrong path this far. And maybe, just maybe, it was not over yet. And without fully understanding why, she nodded, stepping forward to follow him out of the room, still holding onto the map that had brought her here, unaware that she was no longer the only one choosing to follow it. The hallway outside the conference room felt quieter, almost insulated from the intensity they had just left behind, the polished floors reflecting soft overhead lighting as Liam walked ahead without looking back, his pace steady but unhurried, as if he already knew she would follow. And Emily did, not because she fully understood why, but because something about the moment refused to let her simply turn around and walk away. Not yet, not after everything that had just happened. And the sound of her steps echoed faintly behind his, a reminder that she was still here, still inside a place she had never intended to enter, still holding onto a map that no longer made sense. And when he finally stopped, it was not in another boardroom or office, but near a wide window overlooking the city, rain still tracing thin lines down the glass, the skyline blurred into soft lights and distant movement. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching in a way that felt deliberate, not uncomfortable, just open, as if this conversation did not need to rush to begin. And when he turned to face her, his expression had shifted again, less guarded now, less formal, though the quiet control remained. "You handled yourself well in there," he said, not as a compliment, not exaggerated, just a simple statement. And Emily let out a small breath she did not realize she had been holding, her shoulders easing slightly as she gave a faint shake of her head. "I was guessing," she admitted, because anything else would have felt dishonest, because pretending had already taken her further than she expected, and she did not have the energy to maintain it any longer. And to her surprise, the corner of his mouth lifted slightly, not quite a smile, but close enough to feel real. "Most people in that room were guessing too," he replied, his tone calm, almost thoughtful, as if the difference had never been about certainty, but about who was willing to admit it. And Emily glanced down at the map in her hand again, smoothing the wrinkled edge absent-mindedly, the ink now so blurred it was impossible to tell where she had originally been trying to go. "This was supposed to take me to a job interview," she said, almost to herself, the words slipping out before she could stop them, and he followed her gaze, his attention settling on the paper. "And instead it brought you here," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, something that made it sound less like a mistake and more like a fact, like a shift in direction rather than an error, and Emily let out a quiet, almost disbelieving laugh. "I am pretty sure this is not where I am supposed to be," she said, her voice lighter now but still carrying the weight of truth behind it. And he studied her for a moment, really studied her, as if measuring something beyond the obvious, beyond the coat, the damp hair, the uncertainty she was no longer hiding. And when he spoke again, his voice was softer, but no less certain. "You said something in there that no one else did," he said. "You simplified the problem instead of protecting your position." And Emily frowned slightly, not expecting that, not sure what to do with it. "I just said what made sense," she replied, and he nodded once, as if that had confirmed something he had already been considering. And then, without hesitation, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, clean business card, holding it out to her, the gesture simple but deliberate. "If you are still looking for a place to go," he said, "come by tomorrow." And Emily hesitated, her eyes flicking from the card to his face, because there was no explanation attached to the offer, no detailed pitch, just the quiet assumption that she might accept it. And slowly, carefully, she reached out and took it, the card dry and smooth in contrast to the damp paper still in her other hand. And as she looked down, reading the name, printed in clean, precise letters, Liam Parker, the same name she had heard earlier, the same name that seemed to open doors without question, she felt that same strange pull again, that sense that something about tonight had shifted in a way she could not yet understand. And when she looked back up, he was already watching her, not expecting gratitude, not waiting for an answer, just observing, as if the choice itself mattered more than what she decided. And for the first time since she had stepped inside the building, Emily realized this was no longer about being lost. This was about what she would do next. The rain had not stopped by the time Emily stepped back out onto the street, but it felt different now, softer somehow, like the city itself had quieted just enough to let her think. And she stood there for a moment under the building's overhang, the noise of passing cars and distant sirens blending into the background as her attention stayed fixed on the small card in her hand. The name printed in clean black letters sharper than anything else in her night, Liam Parker, and beneath it, a title she did not fully understand but knew carried weight, the kind of weight that explained everything she had just walked through, the doors that opened, the room that listened, the man who had chosen not to expose her when he easily could have. And Emily let out a slow breath, her fingers tightening slightly around the card before she slipped it carefully into the inside pocket of her coat, separate from the damp map she still held, as if the two did not belong together, as if one represented where she had been trying to go and the other something entirely different, something she had not planned for at all. And as she stepped out into the rain, again, pulling her coat closer around her, the cold air hit her face sharply, grounding her back into reality, back into the version of her life that did not involve glass towers or quiet power, but narrow hallways, shared walls, and a calendar marked with overdue bills. And the walk to the subway felt longer than usual, each step heavy with thought, replaying the night over and over, the moment she walked in, the way the room had gone silent, the way he had looked at her, not with judgment, but with something she could not quite name. And she shook her head slightly as she descended the steps into the station, the familiar scent of metal and motion replacing the clean, controlled air of the building she had just left. And by the time she reached the platform, the city had returned to something recognizable, people waiting, phones in hand, conversations half-heard, a world where no one cared if you were lost as long as you kept moving. And Emily leaned lightly against one of the pillars, pulling the map out again, staring at it as if it might suddenly make sense. But the ink had bled too far, the lines no longer leading anywhere clear, and she let out a quiet breath, folding it carefully despite its uselessness, because throwing it away felt wrong, like erasing the reason any of this had happened in the first place. And when the train arrived with a rush of wind and sound, she stepped inside, finding a seat near the window, her reflection faint against the glass as the city blurred past in streaks of light. And for the first time since the night began, the question settled clearly in her mind. not where she had gone wrong, but what she was supposed to do now, because tomorrow was no longer simple, no longer just another attempt to fix what was already slipping through her fingers. Tomorrow held a choice, one she had not been offered in a long time. And as the train carried her farther from the building, from him, from everything that had felt so out of place and yet strangely right, Emily closed her eyes briefly, letting the rhythm of the tracks steady her thoughts. Because no matter how unexpected the night had been, no matter how far off the map she had wandered, one thing was certain: she could not pretend it meant nothing. And somewhere between the blurred lines of the map and the sharp edges of that business card, her life had quietly shifted direction, even if she was not ready to admit it yet. Morning came too quickly, not with clarity, not with certainty, but with the quiet persistence of reality waiting outside her door, and Emily Carter stood in the small space she called her apartment, the faint hum of traffic filtering through the thin window, as early light slipped across the worn wooden floor, her coat still draped over the back of a chair where she had left it the night before, and for a long moment she did not move, did not reach for anything, because the question she had carried home with her had not gone away. It had only grown louder in the silence, and slowly, almost reluctantly, she walked over and slipped her hand into the inside pocket, pulling out the card again, the edges still perfectly sharp, untouched by the rain, untouched by doubt. Liam Parker, the name that now felt heavier than it had any right to, and she stared at it for a few seconds longer than necessary, as if waiting for it to explain itself, as if the decision would somehow be made for her. But it did not, and of course it did not, because this was not about him, not really. It was about her, about what she was willing to risk, about whether stepping into that building again would be another mistake or something entirely different, and she let out a quiet breath, placing the card down on the small table beside her bed, next to a stack of unopened envelopes she did not need to look at to know what they were. Reminders of everything that was already slipping out of her control, and for a moment, the contrast felt almost too sharp to ignore. One path familiar, difficult, predictable, the other uncertain, unexpected, impossible to measure, and Emily ran a hand through her hair, exhaling slowly as she glanced toward the clock, because time was not waiting for her to figure this out, because whether she chose it or not, the day was already moving forward, and with a small shake of her head, she reached for her usual things instead. The routine that made sense, the worn bag by the door, the keys she almost dropped because her hands were not as steady as she wanted them to be, and she stepped out into the hallway, pulling the door closed behind her with a soft click that echoed longer than it should have, as if marking a decision she had not fully admitted yet, and the walk outside felt familiar in a way that grounded her. The cool morning air, the rhythm of people heading somewhere, everyone moving with purpose even if they did not feel it, and Emily joined them, not toward the glass building from last night, not toward the unknown, but toward something she understood, the small diner a few blocks away where she worked morning shifts, where the coffee was always a little too strong and the conversations predictable, where no one expected anything more from her than showing up and getting through the day. And when she pushed open the door, the bell above it chimed softly, the scent of coffee and syrup wrapping around her like something steady, something safe, and she moved behind the counter, tying her apron with practiced ease, slipping back into a version of herself that required less thinking, less risk, until the morning rush began, orders called out, plates moving, time passing in a blur of small, manageable moments. And for a while, it worked. The noise, the motion, the familiarity pushing everything else to the edges of her mind, until there was a brief lull, a pause between customers, and Emily found herself reaching into her pocket without thinking, her fingers brushing against the folded map still there, and she pulled it out slowly, smoothing it against the counter, the ink still blurred, the directions still unreadable, and for a second, she just stared at it, her reflection faint in the surface beneath, because this was where she had been headed, this was what she had trusted, and it had led her somewhere completely different, somewhere she was still trying to understand, and before she could stop herself, her other hand moved, reaching into her coat pocket hanging nearby, pulling out the card again, placing it beside the map, the two things side by side, one worn and uncertain, the other clean and precise. And Emily let out a slow breath, her eyes moving between them as the noise of The diner faded into the background, because now the choice was no longer abstract. It was right in front of her, simple and impossible at the same time. And somewhere deep down, beneath the hesitation and the fear and the instinct to stay where things made sense, there was a quiet, persistent thought she could not ignore, that maybe the wrong map had not led her astray at all. Maybe it had simply shown her a direction she had never considered, and this time, if she walked away from it, it would not be because she did not know the way, it would be because she chose not to take it. The bell above the diner door chimed again, sharp and ordinary, but this time it cut through something deeper than the usual rhythm of the morning. Because Emily did not look up right away, her attention still caught between the worn map and the pristine business card resting side by side on the counter, the contrast between them almost too obvious to ignore now, one representing everything that had gone wrong, the other everything that could go differently. And for a moment she stayed still, her fingers lightly touching the edge of the card as if testing whether it was real, whether last night had actually happened, until the voice of her manager broke through from behind her, impatient but familiar. "Emily, you are on table 6. And she blinked, the world snapping back into place as she quickly gathered herself, sliding the map back into her apron pocket while the card disappeared into her coat again. Out of sight but not out of mind, and she grabbed a notepad, forcing her focus forward as she stepped out from behind the counter, moving toward the booth without thinking too much, because thinking too much was exactly what she was trying to avoid. And as she approached, she began the routine automatically, the practiced smile, the steady voice. "Good morning. What can I get for you?" But the words faltered just slightly when she finally looked up, because sitting there, completely out of place in a diner that had never seen a suit like that before, was Liam Parker, his presence as composed and controlled as it had been in the boardroom, yet somehow even more noticeable here, surrounded by chipped mugs and worn menus. And for a second, Emily simply stared, not dramatically, not loudly, but enough that the moment stretched longer than it should have, because this was not part of any plan, not hers, not his, and yet he was here, sitting in her world as easily as she had stepped into his the night before, and he met her gaze calmly, as if this encounter were the most natural thing in the world, as if crossing that invisible line between their lives required no explanation at all. And after a brief pause, he spoke, his tone steady, almost casual. "Coffee," he said, the simplest order in a place that offered nothing complicated, and Emily exhaled quietly, the tension easing just enough for her to move again, nodding once as she turned back toward the counter, her steps slightly slower than before, her thoughts catching up all at once, because this changed things, this changed everything, the choice she had been holding on to, the distance she thought she had between last night and today, all of it collapsed into this single moment. And as she poured the coffee, the familiar motion grounding her hands even as her mind raced, she glanced briefly over her shoulder, watching him from a distance, the way he sat, composed, patient, not checking his phone, not rushing, just waiting, and something about that unsettled her more than if he had been demanding or out of place, because it meant he had chosen to be here, chosen to step into her world the same way she had stepped into his. And when she returned to the table, placing the cup in front of him carefully, their hands almost brushing but not quite, she hesitated for a fraction of a second before speaking, her voice quieter now, more cautious. "You did not have to come here," she said, not accusing, not defensive, just stating the truth, as she saw it. And he looked up at her, that same unreadable expression settling in again, though this time there was something softer beneath it, something that had not been there before, and he replied simply, "Neither did you." And the words landed between them, calm but undeniable, because he was right, because none of this had been necessary, none of it had been planned, and yet here they were, two people from completely different worlds sitting across from each other again, not by design, not by obligation, but by something far less predictable. And as Emily stood there, the noise of the diner continuing around them, orders being called, dishes clinking, conversations blending into a steady hum, she realized that the decision she thought she still had time to make had already begun to unfold on its own, and this time, walking away might not be as simple as it had been before. Emily did not move right away, and neither did he. the moment stretching quietly between them as the noise of the diner continued around them, ordinary and unchanged, as if nothing significant was happening at table 6. But she could feel it, the shift, subtle but undeniable, the way everything that had seemed distant and separate just minutes ago had suddenly folded into this single point. And she glanced down at the coffee she had just set in front of him, the steam rising in soft curls, grounding her for a second before she forced herself to step back into motion, because standing there too long would draw attention, would invite questions she was not ready to answer. And she had learned long ago how to move through moments like this without letting them fully take over. So she straightened slightly, her voice returning to something more controlled, more familiar. "Do you need anything else?" she asked, the words simple, routine, but carrying something beneath them that neither of them acknowledged directly. And he shook his head once, his gaze steady. "Not right now," he replied, and there was something intentional in the way he said it, like he was leaving space for the conversation to continue later, like this was not an interruption but a beginning. And Emily nodded, turning away before she could think too much about it, before she could question why he had come here or what he expected from this. Because the longer she stayed in that moment, the harder it would be to keep her balance between the life she knew and the one that kept pressing closer without warning. And the next hour passed in fragments, orders taken, plates carried, conversations half-heard, but none of it felt as solid as it usually did, because her attention kept drifting back, not constantly, not obviously, but enough that she was aware of him even when she was not looking, the quiet presence at table 6 that did not fit and yet did not feel out of place either. And every time she passed by, she noticed something new, the way he held the cup without rushing, the way he observed the room without judgment, as if he was studying a world he did not usually see. And once, just once, their eyes met again, brief but enough to remind her that this was real, that he was actually here, not just a continuation of last night. And when the rush finally began to slow, the diner settling into a quieter rhythm, Emily found herself moving toward his table again without fully deciding to, her steps slower this time, more deliberate. And when she stopped across from him, there was no pretense left, no routine to hide behind, just a question she could not ignore any longer. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice low but steady. And he looked up at her, not surprised by the question, not caught off guard, just present, as if he had been waiting for it. And for a second he did not answer, his gaze holding hers in a way that made the noise around them fade again, until finally he spoke, his tone calm, almost simple. "Because you did not come," he said, and the words landed softly but carried more weight than she expected, because they were not demanding, not accusing, just factual. And Emily felt her breath catch slightly, her mind replaying the morning, the card on the table, the choice she had avoided making, and she let out a quiet exhale, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the table as she steadied herself. "I did not know if I should," she admitted, and for the first time, something shifted in his expression, not dramatic, not obvious, but there was a hint of understanding there, something that made the distance between them feel a little less defined. And he nodded once, as if that answer made sense, as if hesitation was not something he dismissed, and then he said, "Then do not decide yet," his voice steady, offering something that felt less like pressure and more like space. "Just come see." And Emily looked at him for a moment longer, searching for something in his words, some hidden expectation or condition, but there was none, just a quiet certainty that left the choice entirely in her hands. And as she stood there, the worn map still folded in her pocket and the business card tucked safely away, she realized this was not about being pulled into his world or escaping her own. It was about stepping into something unknown without knowing how it would end. And for the first time since all of this began, that possibility did not feel entirely out of reach. Emily did not answer him right away, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow down to the quiet space between them, the hum of the diner fading just enough for her to hear her own thoughts more clearly than she wanted to, because what he was offering was not complicated, not wrapped in conditions or expectations, and somehow that made it harder, not easier. And she looked at him for a second longer before giving a small, almost uncertain nod, not a full agreement, not yet, but not a refusal either, and that seemed to be enough for him, because he did not press further, did not ask for more than she was ready to give, and instead he simply finished his coffee, setting the cup down with a quiet finality that marked the end of the moment without forcing it. And as he stood, the difference between him and everything around them became more obvious again, not in a way that made him distant, but in a way that reminded her how easily he moved between worlds she was still trying to understand. And for a second, she wondered if this was where it would end, just another strange encounter that would fade back into memory. But before he turned to leave, he reached into his pocket again, pulling out the same card she already had, placing it gently on the table as if reinforcing something that did not need repeating. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice calm, not demanding, just certain, and then he stepped away, moving toward the door with the same steady confidence he carried everywhere else. And Emily watched him go, not following, not stopping him, just standing there as the bell chimed softly and the door closed behind him, and the diner returned to its usual rhythm as if nothing had happened. But she knew better, because something had happened, something that would not simply disappear once her shift ended. And the rest of the day passed in a blur she barely registered, her movements automatic, her responses practiced, but her mind somewhere else entirely, replaying his words, not what he said exactly, but how he said it, the space he left, the absence of pressure. And when her shift finally ended and she stepped back out into the city, the afternoon light felt different from the morning, warmer, more open, but no less uncertain, and she walked slowly, not toward home right away, not toward anything specific, just moving, letting the rhythm of the streets settle her thoughts the way it always had, until she found herself stopping at a small park a few blocks away, the kind of place people passed through more than they stayed in, and she sat down on a bench, reaching into her pocket again, pulling out both the map and the card, placing them side by side in her hands the way she had earlier, but this time it felt different, less like a comparison and more like a choice she could not keep postponing. And she looked at the map first, at the blurred lines that no longer led anywhere clear, remembering how certain she had been when she first followed it, how she had trusted it to take her somewhere better. And then she looked at the card, at the clean simplicity of it, the directness of the offer it represented, and she let out a slow breath, leaning back slightly as the sounds of the park drifted around her. Distant conversations, footsteps on pavement, the quiet movement of a world that kept going regardless of her decision. And for the first time since this all began, she allowed herself to consider something she had been avoiding, not whether she belonged in his world, not whether she was qualified or ready or capable, but whether she was willing to step into something that did not come with guarantees. And the answer did not come all at once. It did not arrive in a sudden realization or a clear moment of certainty, but it settled slowly, quietly, like something she had already known but had not yet said out loud. And as she looked down at the card again, her grip tightening slightly, she understood that tomorrow was no longer just an option. It was a direction, one she could choose to take or walk away from. But either way, it would change something. And as the light shifted around her, stretching longer shadows across the ground, Emily Carter made a decision she would not fully understand until much later. But for now, it was enough that she finally stood up, slipping the cards safely into her pocket, no longer hesitating, no longer waiting, because for the first time, she was not following the map. She was choosing where it would lead. The next morning did not feel like any other morning Emily had known. Not because the city had changed or because her apartment looked different in the pale light filtering through the window, but because something inside her had shifted in a way she could not ignore. And as she stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the sleeve of her coat with careful, deliberate movements, she caught her own reflection and paused, not because of how she looked, but because of the quiet realization that she was no longer trying to convince herself to go. She had already decided. And that decision carried a weight that made everything feel sharper, more defined, from the sound of her footsteps in the hallway to the way the cold morning air met her face as she stepped outside. And this time, when she reached into her pocket, she did not hesitate before pulling out the card, did not question whether it still meant something. She simply looked at it once, then tucked it back securely as if it were a direction she had chosen to follow. And the walk toward the building felt different from the night before, not rushed, not uncertain, but steady, each step grounded in a quiet resolve that replaced the confusion she had carried yesterday. And when the glass tower came into view again, Rising above the street with the same quiet authority, Emily slowed. Just slightly, not out of fear, but out of awareness, because she understood now what it represented, not just a place, but a threshold, and as she approached the entrance, the reflection of the city shifting across its surface, she took a small breath before stepping inside, the warmth and controlled calm of the lobby greeting her once more, but this time, it did not feel as foreign, not as overwhelming. And when the receptionist looked up, her expression polite but curious, Emily did not falter. She did not look for the map or second-guess her presence. She simply said, "I am here to see Liam Parker." And even as the words left her mouth, they felt more natural than she expected, as if speaking them had already become part of the path she had chosen. And the receptionist nodded, recognizing the name immediately, her demeanor shifting subtly as she reached for the phone, and within moments, Emily was being guided once again through the same hallway she had stumbled into the night before, but now each step felt intentional, each door opening not because of a mistake, but because she had chosen to walk through it. And when she reached the office at the end of the corridor, the door already slightly open, she paused just briefly before knocking softly, the sound barely louder than her own heartbeat. And from inside, his voice came, calm and familiar, "Come in." And when she stepped inside, the space was different from the conference room, quieter, more personal. The city visible through wide windows behind him as he stood near the desk, his attention shifting to her the moment she entered. And for a second, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because this moment carried something new, something that had not existed before, the shift from chance to choice. And Emily held his gaze steadily, no longer unsure of why she was there, no longer pretending to be someone she was not. And after a brief pause, she said simply, "I came." And the words, though small, felt significant, because they carried everything that had led her to this point. And Liam nodded once, as if that was all he needed to hear, his expression unchanged on the surface, but with that same quiet understanding beneath it. And as he gestured toward the chair across from him, inviting her to sit, the distance between their two worlds did not disappear, but it no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like something they were about to cross, step by step, not by accident this time, but by choice. Emily sat down slowly, the chair across from Liam's desk feeling both ordinary and unfamiliar at the same time, as if it existed somewhere between two versions of her life that had not fully connected yet. And for a moment, she placed her hands lightly in her lap, grounding herself in the simple reality of being here, because this was no longer an accident, no longer a mistake she could quietly step away from. This was something she had chosen, and that made every second feel more real, more defined. And across from her, Liam watched without interruption, not rushing to fill the silence, not guiding the moment forward before she was ready, and that alone steadied her more than any explanation could have. And after a brief pause, he moved slightly, reaching for a folder on his desk, placing it between them with a calm, deliberate motion that drew her attention without demanding it. "I want you to look at something," he said, his voice even, and Emily glanced down at the folder, hesitating for just a second before opening it, her fingers careful as if whatever was inside carried more weight than it appeared. And as she flipped it open, she saw pages filled with charts, notes, and outlines. But unlike the meeting before, this felt different, less overwhelming, more focused, as if it had been simplified just enough to be understood without losing its importance. And she scanned the first page, her brow furrowing slightly as she tried to piece together what she was looking at. And after a moment, she looked back up at him, her expression questioning but not intimidated. "What is this?" she asked, and he leaned back slightly, his gaze steady. "A project that should have been simple," he replied, but somehow became complicated, and there was a subtle emphasis in the way he said it, enough to remind her of the words she had spoken in the meeting, enough to make her realize this was not random, not just a test or an exercise, but something connected to the moment that had brought her here. And Emily looked back, down at the pages, her attention sharpening as she began to read more carefully, tracing the structure, the decisions, the points where things had become unclear. And slowly, almost without noticing, she leaned forward slightly, her focus shifting from uncertainty to engagement, because this she could understand in her own way, not through formal training or experience, but through instinct, through the same clarity that had guided her the night before, and she picked up a pen from the desk without asking, her movements natural now, unforced, and began to mark small notes in the margins, not rewriting everything, not trying to impress, just simplifying, connecting, questioning where things did not make sense. And as she worked, the silence between them changed again, not empty, but active, filled with quiet concentration, and after a few minutes, she paused, tapping the pen lightly against the page as she gathered her thoughts, then looked up at him again, her voice steady. "You are trying to do too much at once," she said, echoing her earlier instinct but now grounded in something more tangible. "If you narrow it down, you will see where the problem actually starts." And Liam did not respond immediately, his eyes moving from her to the notes she had made, taking in the changes, the adjustments, the way she had stripped away what was unnecessary without disrupting the core. And for a moment, something shifted in his expression, not surprise, not disbelief, but recognition, as if what he had suspected was now confirmed, and he nodded once, slowly, before speaking. "You see it the same way," he said, not asking, just stating, and Emily hesitated slightly, not because she doubted herself, but because she was not used to being seen this way, not used to having her perspective carry weight in a room like this, and she gave a small, almost cautious nod in return. And then he leaned forward again, his hands resting lightly on the desk, his voice calm but more direct now. "Then stay," he said, the words simple but carrying more meaning than anything else he had offered so far. "Work with me on this." And the room fell quiet again. But this time the silence was different, heavier, because this was no longer an invitation to observe, no longer a suggestion to come and see. This was an opportunity, clear and undeniable, and Emily felt it immediately, the shift from possibility to decision, from curiosity to commitment. And for a moment she looked down at the pages again, at the notes she had made, at the space where her thoughts had already begun to take shape in a world she had never expected to enter. And when she finally looked back up at him, there was no confusion left in her expression, only a quiet understanding of what this meant. And she realized that this was the moment everything changed, not because of where she had been led, but because of what she was about to choose. Emily did not answer immediately, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath with her, the city stretching endlessly behind Liam through the tall glass windows, while the quiet weight of his words settled between them. Because this was no longer about a wrong turn or an unexpected meeting. This was something deliberate, something real, and she looked down at the folder again, at the notes she had written without hesitation, at the way her thoughts had found space here without permission or preparation. And for the first time in a long time, she did not feel like she was trying to fit into something. She felt like she was already part of it, and that realization was both steadying and overwhelming at the same time. And she let out a slow breath before lifting her gaze back to him, her expression no longer uncertain, no longer guarded, but honest in a way that did not need explanation. "I do not know everything," she said quietly, not as a warning, not as an excuse, but as a truth she was not afraid to admit. And Liam's response was immediate, not in words at first, but in the slight shift of his posture, the way he leaned forward just enough to close the distance between the idea and the decision. "I am not looking for someone who knows everything," he said, his voice calm, steady. "I am looking for someone who sees clearly." And the simplicity of it settled something inside her that she had not realized was still resisting, because it was not about proving herself, not about becoming something else. It was about stepping forward as she already was. And for a second, she allowed herself to feel that fully, the fear, the uncertainty, the possibility, all of it coexisting without canceling each other out. And then she nodded, once, small but certain. And that was enough, because something in the room shifted immediately, not dramatically, not visibly, but in a way that made everything feel more aligned, more intentional. And Liam mirrored the nod, a quiet acknowledgement that did not need to be emphasized, and he reached out, closing the folder gently, not ending the conversation, but marking the beginning of something else, something that would extend beyond this moment. And as Emily stood, the chair sliding back softly behind her, she felt the difference again, not in the room, not in him, but in herself, The way her steps felt more grounded. The way her presence no longer carried the same hesitation it had when she first walked in, and as she moved toward the door, she paused briefly, reaching into her pocket and pulling out the folded map. The paper now creased and faded from everything it had been through, and she looked at it one last time, not with frustration, not with confusion, but with a quiet understanding of what it had given her, and without ceremony, without regret, she set it down on the edge of his desk, a small, simple gesture that said more than words could, because she no longer needed it, and Liam's gaze followed the movement, not questioning, not interrupting, just observing, as if he understood exactly what that meant. And when she looked back at him, there was a faint hint of something warmer in his expression, something that had not been there before, and he said, almost lightly, "You found your way." And Emily allowed herself a small smile, not exaggerated, not performative, just real. "I think I stopped getting lost," she replied, and the words carried a quiet confidence that had not existed when this began. And as she stepped out of the office, the hallway no longer felt unfamiliar. The building no longer felt like a place she had accidentally entered. It felt like a path she had chosen, one that would not be easy, one that would challenge everything she thought she knew, but one that was hers now. And as the door closed softly behind her, Emily Carter walked forward not because she had followed the right directions, but because she had learned to trust where she was going, even without a map. She followed a wrong map on a rainy night and accidentally walked into a world she never belonged to, where a struggling waitress met a powerful CEO in a moment that would quietly change both of their lives. This emotional journey explores how a simple mistake can lead to unexpected connection, as the young woman navigates doubt, survival, and self-worth while the billionaire businessman searches for something real beyond status and control. Their paths cross again in the most ordinary place, revealing a story built on contrast, honesty, and quiet transformation. This is one of those unforgettable millionaire stories where a small decision becomes a turning point, where kindness and clarity matter more than background, where a poor girl does not chase wealth but finds her own voice, and a millionaire CEO does not offer rescue but recognizes truth. As tension builds between two different worlds, the narrative unfolds with emotional depth and cinematic pacing, making it one of the most compelling millionaire stories that highlight how real connection begins when masks fall away. From a mistaken meeting in a corporate boardroom to a quiet diner conversation that shifts everything, this story captures the essence of modern millionaire stories where love is not immediate but earned through trust and choice. The young woman's journey from uncertainty to confidence reflects the core message that true value is not defined by money but by perspective, while the CEO's transformation reveals that power means nothing without authenticity. As their lives slowly intertwine, each moment builds toward a meaningful payoff that defines the best kind of millionaire stories, where growth is mutual and love is grounded in respect. This story stands out among millionaire stories by focusing on emotional realism, internal conflict, and the courage to step into the unknown, ultimately showing that sometimes getting lost is the only way to truly find where you belong. Character 1. A 24-year-old white woman, struggling waitress, simple worn coat and modest clothes, natural look, soft expression, realistic lighting, front-facing portrait, subtle emotion, cinematic realism, no makeup glamour, authentic environment, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. Character 2. A 34-year-old white male billionaire CEO, sharp jawline, clean hairstyle, tailored dark suit, confident composed expression, front-facing portrait, cinematic lighting, powerful presence. Minimal background, realistic detail, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration.